Public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its two inquiries into International Labour Organisation Convention number 187, Promotional Framework for Occupational Safety and Health Convention, and International Labour Organisation Convention number 191, Safe and Healthy Working Environment Consequential Amendments Convention. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us. I now welcome representatives of the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee this morning?
Lani Rankin, International Labour Director at the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations.
Christina Bilbo, Acting Assistant Secretary, Economics and International Labour Branch, Department of Employment and Workplace Relations.
Adrian Breen, Assistant Secretary, Workplace Relations, Legal Division, Department of Employment and Workplace Relations.
Elizabeth DeHoog, Assistant Secretary, Work Health and Safety Policy Branch in the Workplace Relations Group of the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations.
Kate Mitchell, Director in the International Law Branch at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Excellent. Although the committee doesn't require you to give your evidence this morning under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses, which means the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and detracts parliamentary privilege. It's the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. So I invite you now to make an opening statement before we proceed to questions and a discussion.
Thank you, Chair. We do have an opening statement. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today excuse me, on the proposed ratification of two international labour organisation conventions, the Promotional Framework for Occupational Safety and Health Convention number 187 and the Safe and Healthy Working Environment Consequential Amendments Convention number 191. These two conventions relate to the provision of a safe and healthy working environment and align with Australia's law and practice in this area. Australia engages at the International Labour Organisation, or the ILO, on a tripartite basis with the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, both of whom support ratification of these conventions. Convention 187 calls on member states to establish, implement and promote national policies, systems and programs in consultation with workers and employers' organisations to promote a safe and healthy working environment with the aim of reducing and preventing occupational injuries, diseases and deaths. Turning to Convention 191, this can be described as a revising convention which resulted from a decision by the International Labour Conference in 2022 to elevate the principle of a safe and healthy working environment to be an ILO fundamental principle and right at work. Convention 191 amends 8 ILO instruments to ensure this elevated right is appropriately included in either preambles or operative paragraphs. For Australia, there are operative amendments to 2 conventions to which we are a party, namely the Maritime Labour Convention 2006 and the Violence and Harassment Convention 2019. Ratification of both conventions would demonstrate Australia's commitment to workplace health and safety as a fundamental principle and right at work. It will ensure governments continue to promote safe and healthy working environment and protect workers from occupational harm in line with international best practice. From an international perspective, ratifying Convention 187 would mean that Australia has ratified all 10 fundamental ILO conventions. Australia would join a small group of countries who have achieved this milestone, further upholding our standing in the international community and demonstrating Australia's commitment to the implementation of key ILO standards, including within our region. I will turn now to Australia's compliance with both conventions. Australia has a well-developed national scheme that promotes and protects occupational safety and health, established in consultation with key stakeholders, including employers and workers. The requirements of the conventions are satisfied through Australia's National Model Work Health and Safety, or WHS, framework, the role of Safe Work Australia, WHS laws and WHS regulatory bodies within each jurisdiction, the 2008 Intergovernmental Agreement for Regulatory and Operational Reform in Occupational Health and Safety and accompanying policies and programs. Additionally, with respect to the changes made by Convention 191, Commonwealth, state and territory laws and policies covering anti-discrimination, workplace relations, criminal activity and maritime safety also contribute to meeting the requirements of this convention. Significantly, ratifying these conventions aligns with the aims of the Australian Work Health and Safety Strategy 2023-33, which was developed and agreed through Safe Work Australia. The strategy establishes a national vision for safe and healthy work for all and provides the platform for delivering key work health and safety improvements to achieve this vision. Ratifying these conventions would further contribute to creating safe and healthy work that promotes social and economic well-being of all workers in Australia. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll begin with a couple of questions and I'll then go to the Deputy Chair before we see what other committee members might want to ask. In relation to Convention number 187, which entered into force back in 2009, there's obviously been a few years that have passed between then and now. Is there a particular reason, or are there reasons why sometimes we ratify these things sooner and sometimes later?
Specifically with consideration to the ratification of Convention 187, timing, it has progressed quite quickly given that it was only elevated to fundamental status in 2022. So prior to its elevation, Australia has prioritised other fundamental ILO instruments such as the Forced Labour Protocol and the Minimum Age Convention. And most recently, the government has prioritised ratification of the Violence and Harassment Convention, which was a recommendation of the Respect at Work report.
And the advice we're given is that by taking that step with respect to ratification, there aren't changes required to Commonwealth, state or territory legislation to make Australia compliant with obligations under the Convention?
That's correct. Our assessment has confirmed that there's no legislative changes required in order to ratify the Convention.
But obviously, by being a kind of an active participant in this type of multilateral commitment, it allows us, or it improves Australia's position when it comes to advocating regionally for other countries to take a similar approach. You just said before that Australia now is in a relatively small group by having or moving to ratify, I think you said, all 10 of the relevant agreements. How small a group?
That's correct, Chair. So there's 27 countries who have ratified all 10 fundamental ILO. 20? 20, yes. 20 countries who have ratified all 10 fundamental ILO conventions to date.
And who would be some of the notable examples of that 20, like New Zealand, countries in the EU?
Just while we're bringing that information up, I will just flag that Australia would be the first country in the Asia-Pacific region to have ratified all 10 fundamental conventions, which we see as a really great achievement and, as you mentioned, can help in our advocacy work in encouraging other countries in the Asia-Pacific to also ratify fundamental conventions. So there's 20 countries.
20 countries. I'm happy to go through those now. So Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Côte d'Ivoire, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Lesotho, Luxembourg, Madagascar, Malawi, Niger, Norway, Portugal, Russian Federation, Spain and Sweden.
It's quite a diverse group.
That's correct.
And my final question, it's noted in our papers that the work of improving workplace standards in the Asia-Pacific is significant. The Asia-Pacific has the highest mortality rate from work-related incidents, and that those mortalities cover something like 63% of the global total of such mortalities. And that, I think, is a sobering way of understanding the significance of making sure that there are safe workplaces everywhere, including in Australia. I assume that through our diplomatic and development assistance engagement in the region, working to advocate for and support other countries in the pursuit of safer workplaces is a sort of a standing agenda item or a standing action item of that work. Would that be correct?
That is correct. And I would just further note, I suppose, in terms of what I said in my opening statement, that ratifying these conventions from a regional perspective really lend Australia the gravitas to call on others in the Asia Pacific to also ratify these conventions. It also complements the work that we have underway in the Pacific, which includes supporting ratification of priority conventions in the Pacific with a particular focus on the fundamental principles and rights at work, including ratification of these conventions.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Deputy Chair?
I only have one question. Thank you for coming in. It was very in-depth opening. When you just said you'll be able to, or put us in a better position to call on others to ratify or to engage, who are you talking about? Like other nations? Like, are you waiting for something to happen to do it, or are we leading the charge and calling on everyone to get involved? What do you mean?
Well, specifically, I think within our region, this is quite an important signalling in terms of leading the charge there. As Ms Rankin noted, importantly, we would be the first country within our region to implement all 10 fundamental ILO conventions.
And I suppose I could add some further detail about our work in the Pacific. So Australia has provided the ILO's Pacific office with funding to work on a project to strengthen labour standards in the Pacific, and that has covered fundamental conventions. In relation to OSH specifically, it includes projects with the Cook Islands and with Fiji, and developing a Pacific OSH toolkit more broadly. So I suppose, if we're encouraging countries in the Pacific to ratify these conventions, we would also first want to have ratified them ourselves. So we would be extremely proud to have ratified all 10, and we think it would be a great achievement.
Excellent.
Committee members?
Senator Kennedy. Thanks, Chair. Can I just ask about the 191? This is, my understanding is it's adding in, well, it includes an obligation to promote a safe and healthy working environment. Is that just for the maritime sector? I couldn't quite work it out. I was trying to find the text. Or is it more broadly across our economy?
So ratification of Convention 191 would amend to, I suppose, create 2 new obligations that are created by the Convention, and one does relate to the Maritime Labour Convention. The second convention would be the Violence and Harassment Convention. So Article 5 of the Violence and Harassment Convention requires that Australia's laws, policies and practices respect, promote and realise fundamental principles and rights at work with a view to the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment. Through ratification of Convention 191, it would add the right of a safe and healthy work environment into this article, which is Article 5 of the Violence and Harassment Convention.
So that's for all workplaces?
Yes.
That around the violence and harassment?
Yeah.
But is the promote a safe and healthy working environment, is that change just for the maritime agreement, or no?
It covers both.
Okay.
So what the ILO did when it elevated a safe and healthy work environment to be a fundamental right was basically to go through and look at, okay, where did we list all of... There were previously 8 conventions and 4 fundamental principles and rights. We've added the safe and healthy work environment plus these 2 OSH conventions. So I suppose what the ILO is doing is going and checking all the existing conventions that listed what were the fundamental principles and rights, and is adding in this new fundamental principle and right. It's just correcting all the references in existing ILO conventions.
So it does cover all workplaces. It would be a treaty obligation would cover all Australian workplaces.
To the extent that it's now an obligation in Convention 190 for violence and harassment, that is correct. They've also amended, as you know, the Maritime Labour Convention. They've also amended a reference in the Domestic Workers Convention, but because Australia has not ratified the Domestic Workers Convention, that isn't a new obligation for us in particular. And you may have seen there's also amendments to some preambles in other ILO instruments, but preambles do not create legal obligations. They're more contextual.
Okay. So how do we define a safe and healthy working environment?
So that would be defined through our work health and safety legislative framework by definition. So I will refer, I think, that question over to my colleagues.
Does
Mr. Green.
a domestic workplace legislation use those terms?
So, Senator Adrian Breen, Workplace Relations Legal Division, the domestic legislation doesn't necessarily use those terms, doesn't need to. The analysis of the convention that we're looking at here now is that those requirements in the convention will be met by the existing laws in Australia, work health safety laws. There's general duties under our work health safety laws to provide a safe working environment. And so it's not necessarily bringing in a new, or it's not bringing in a new requirement through the ratification of this convention into the domestic laws.
Maybe I noticed if you could give me the specific text that we use in our current laws. I suppose I'm always a little, alarm bells start to ring for me when there's sort of vague, like safe and healthy, could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Of course.
And then, of course, we rubber stamp it, then it's over to you and the bureaucracy and the judiciary to sort of work that out, to fill in the gaps. So is there any definition in this text about what a safe, is there any examples given about what a safe and healthy working environment would be, or conversely, what an unsafe or unhealthy environment would be under this proposed text?
So, sorry, Senator, you're referring to the domestic laws or to the convention?
Both.
The convention, okay. Well, we might take that on notice if that's okay, just in terms of the sort of language that's used. I mean, as I say, the language doesn't necessarily line up word for word, but the obligations are the same. But in terms of the actual definitions, we can take
I mean, I raise this because there have been some contemporary examples of issues arising. So, say, for example, there have been people sacked from their job for having particular views about, Christian views about marriage, for example. If someone maintained that in the workplace, would they be creating an unsafe or unhealthy environment? So, Senator, it would depend on the circumstance. That's the problem. And I wouldn't sort of be able to speculate, but just to point out that the work health safety laws in Australia, and as is contemplated by the Convention, cover both physical and psychosocial safety and those sorts of concepts. But difficult to give an opinion on it. Yeah. What if someone didn't use someone's preferred pronouns? Would that be a breach? Someone's preferred, sorry? Pronouns. I can't comment on a particular circumstance, Senator. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, I thought I had some questions on the other one, but I just can't find them right now. Maybe you could go to others, Chair, if others have questions, and I might come back. Thank you.
Senators? Senator Green?
Thanks very much. Just going back to those questions around the impact of Convention 190 on promoting safe and healthy work environment. I note from your evidence this morning and the information we've been provided that would include a view to the prevention of elimination of violence and harassment in workplaces. Am I correct in saying that that's the elimination of violence and harassment in workplaces is covered by 190?
That's correct.
And you said that it's your understanding that the laws we currently have and the policies that we have would meet that obligation. What are those? Can you talk us through some of the domestic policies and laws we already have in place that have moved us into being able to say we confidently think we can meet those obligations?
Certainly. There's a range of Commonwealth, state and territory laws and policies that I suppose provide a comprehensive framework to respect, promote and realise the right to a safe and healthy working environment, so including, I guess, in relation to Convention 187 and the amendments that are made to Convention 187 and the Respect at Work Convention C190. So workplace health and safety laws, policies and practices have been established nationally, and they've aimed at creating a safe and healthy working environment to ensure all workplaces take steps to prevent and address potential harms. There's anti-discrimination laws and practices that have been established. They include prohibitions on discrimination and harassments in employment, positive duties on employers to prevent certain forms of discrimination and harassment. I note that the Fair Work Act also prohibits workplace sexual harassment and adverse action based on certain protected attributes, as well as enables the Fair Work Commission to make an order to stop bullying and stop sexual harassment. In addition, there's also a range of criminal laws that provide additional coverage and avenues for prosecution against this issue where appropriate and necessary.
Thanks. And acknowledging that a safe workplace is free from sexual harassment, is that one of the areas that we're hoping to influence our region and our partners in the region in developing laws around preventing sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yes, that would be correct, absolutely.
Okay. What other parts of this convention, noting that the convention wouldn't require any changes to Commonwealth, state or territory laws, what are the other parts of the convention or the obligations under the conventions that we're looking to promote throughout the region? You said you referred to it in your answers to the Deputy Chair, but I'm just wondering what are the particular areas that we're hoping to promote within the region. I think sexual harassment and the prevention of sexual harassment in workplaces is a very good place to start. I'm just wondering if there's other thematic ideas that we're seeking to, either through this convention, ratifying or others.
Lani Rankin here. I can take that one. In terms of the funding that we have provided for work in the Pacific, we have a focus on the fundamentals, obviously, because they're kind of the core ones that we would always wish to start with in terms of the 10 fundamentals and encouraging Pacific Island countries to implement law and practice and ideally ratify those conventions. And certainly the work of the ILO's Pacific office has included encouraging countries to ratify C190. In fact, Fiji ratified C190 as a follow-on from some assistance that Australia provided to that country. And I guess more broadly in the region, we would always encourage countries to focus on the fundamental conventions. We do have a strategic engagement framework with the ILO which identifies Australia's priorities more broadly for engagement with the ILO, and that includes gender equality, forced labour and child labour, work in the Pacific and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So they're the priorities that we have identified with the ILO in terms of our formal engagement. And of course, whenever we're in Geneva or at the International Labour Conference, working on various new policies or treaties, there's often a reference to fundamental conventions as being, I guess, the first starting point.
Yep. And just one last question, Chair. Thank you. Just going back to this idea of ratifying all 10 fundamental conventions. I guess the conventions themselves are important and the protections or the obligations within them are important. But in terms of our standing internationally, what does it mean to be able to say that we've ratified all 10? What would that mean in the discussions that we're having internationally and particularly within our region to be one of the few countries that have done that?
I think it signals our commitment to the ILO more broadly, to the multilateral rules-based order, but also to labour standards. We've been a proud member of the ILO since it was founded in 1919. As I said, we would be extremely proud to have ratified all of the 10 fundamental conventions and also to encourage other countries in our region to do so. As Ms Bilbo said, it gives us more gravitas when we're speaking on developing new ILO materials and so forth, to be able to actually hand on our hat so that we have done this and encourage others to do so, because of course we want workers throughout the world to be safe and have a healthy work environment.
Thank you. I will be proud too, but thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Green. Senator Canavan?
Oh, yes, I just had one more on the other convention, the 187. In the notes we've been provided, it said that the Minister had written to state and territory ministers in 2002 and followed up in March this year. What were the responses of those ministers?
In terms of engagement with states and territories, we regularly meet with states and territories 3 times a year, in fact, about International Labour Organisation priorities. So we have engaged extensively with states and territories through the law and practice assessment process, and all have provided information indicating their law and practice complies with both conventions, C191 and C187. So as you noted, Minister Burke wrote to his state and territory counterparts about these conventions, firstly in August 2022, when we wanted to commence considering this convention, when it was elevated to fundamental. He also wrote in November 2023 about Convention 191, and then in March 2024 he also wrote indicating that we were seeking support for taking the next steps towards ratification, i.e. tabling in Parliament and undertaking this process. No state or territory has indicated opposition to ratification. I would note Western Australia has not yet provided the formal support in writing, and Tasmania has provided in principle support. Both jurisdictions are still finalising their formal cabinet processes that they must go through. Victoria and Northern Territory are still finalising their formal processes for C191, but have provided the formal support for Convention 187, and there's always been support at the officials level. We would anticipate that indications of formal support from these jurisdictions would be received prior to Australia lodging its instruments of ratification, which of course could not occur until at least late 2024, subject to, of course, your committee's consideration and recommendation and approval of the Executive Council.
Okay. I suppose, I don't know if this is possible, but could we sort of have a standing question on notice that if those responses come back from, I think you mentioned Tasmania and Western Australia,
yep,
before we're complete, could you let us know?
Certainly.
Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair.
Mr Burnell?
I just wanted to probably segue off the back of Senator Canavan, just in relation to Victoria. They haven't adopted the model WHS provisions. So is there any significant difference between Victoria's standards and the WHS model laws? And has there been or any what's the right word? Any research into whether or not there's going to be a potential future implication for them not adopting the model WHS laws?
So the situation with Victoria, the substance of their work health safety laws are materially the same as those provided for in the model laws that have been adopted in the other jurisdictions. It remains, I guess, because of that misalignment, it just remains something that will need to be considered going forward in terms of compliance, but at this point in time there are no issues in terms of compliance for that jurisdiction.
So that compare and contrast has been done?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's it from me, Chair.
Okay. Committee members? No? All right. Well, thank you all for your attendance here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and have the opportunity to request any changes to transcription errors. Please send your responses to any questions taken on notice. I think the only one really was just Senator Canavan asking that the committee be advised if the further responses from relevant state and territories be notified to us. I mean, particularly if for some reason, which I can't imagine, but it's always possible, if the response was in some way a fly in the ointment, it'd be worth us hearing that. And we need, I don't think there are any other questions on notice, but...
What about the current legislation and whether it covers safe and healthy?
Yeah, that's right, sorry, the
Yep.
definitional bits and pieces. Could you please make sure that we receive those by close of business on the 15th of July so that we can complete our inquiry report in a timely way. But again, thank you for your attendance here today.
Thank you.
I declare this public hearing closed, committee members, and we'll just pause for a second while we get the separate departmental people in for our good afternoon. I'll declare open this public briefing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. In accordance with the committee's resolution, this briefing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee, and I now welcome representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is John Watts. I'm the Acting First Assistant Secretary, Free Trade Agreement and Stakeholder Engagement Division, DFAT.
Good afternoon, Chair. My name is Matthew Duckworth. I'm the Acting First Assistant Secretary, Office of Global Trade Negotiations, DFAT.
Hello, Chair. My name is Charlotte Blundell. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the Indo-Pacific Economic Branch. Thank you.
Good morning again, Chair. Kate Mitchell, Director in the International Law Branch at DFAT.
Good morning. I'm Richard Emerson-Elliott, Assistant Secretary of FTA Implementation and Inclusive Trade Branch in DFAT.
Thanks very much. Hello, Chair. Jeremy Sherm, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Trade Law Branch at DFAT.
Great. Thank you all. The committee doesn't require to give evidence today under oath, but the briefing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as the proceedings of the respective houses, which means giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and can be regarded as a contempt. The evidence you give today will be recorded by Hansard and does attract parliamentary privilege. and it's the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. We're very happy to hear a brief opening statement if you'd like to make one, but I would understand if you hadn't prepared one, considering the kind of concept of this briefing is just to give members of the J. Scott the opportunity twice a year to ask some questions about the way that various different trade opportunities are being considered and pursued. So we're in your hands if there's something you'd like to say by way of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. There's no opening statement from DFA.
No, okay. So as I noted, the concept of this briefing came out of the inquiry, own motion inquiry that the committee held, I think I'm going to be right in saying, in the last Parliament, Report 193, and some recommendations that were made to sort of improve the function that the committee plays in giving parliamentarians the opportunity and through the work of the committee, in some ways the broader community, the opportunity to understand the circumstances in which trade and investment opportunities are being considered and approved. So I'm happy to start with just a sort of a general inquiry. I mean, this committee understands that Australia is interested in and negotiating a potential trade and investment agreement with the UAE. We were certainly mindful that there was an opportunity to settle an agreement with the EU that was proceeding along for a while, but has had to deal with all of the various different circumstances that can affect those kinds of negotiations, including elections and all the rest of it in the EU. And because this committee dealt with what was described as the early harvest bilateral arrangement between Australia and India, there's the understanding that, of course, in time to come, Australia would very much like to see a sort of a fully fledged trade and investment agreement settled bilaterally between ourselves and India. So I'd be happy to hear anything that you're able to tell us just about where those three arrangements might be up to, the UAE, EU and India. I know you could probably hold forth some considerable period of time on those topics, but anything that you can say to us in summary about where those matters are at, I think would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair. Well, perhaps I'll start with the UAE. Matt could do EU, and then I think back to me for India. So on the UAE, we have our negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, so-called CEPA. There are a range of benefits I think we can get out for Australian goods, services and investment. The UAE has low tariffs already on goods. They average about 5%, but there are some commodities that have tariff peaks. Wine, for example, is 50%. So there are some benefits to have on the goods side. There's also traditionally in the Middle East been non-tariff barriers that we've had to contend with, issues like shelf life of our products for meat and dairy, for example, historically, and those sort of non-tariff barriers are also something we're looking at. Professional services, education, digital trade, there's a number of areas in the services where we think we can make some gains. And on investment, we're looking for some investment facilitation to assist in our energy transition. You may be aware the UAE has very large sovereign wealth funds with great ability to be able to invest, and we're hoping that this FTA will help in some sort of head-turning effects on our investment into our energy transition. So that's sort of the broad outline. I think at the last Senate estimates you asked Senator Farrell about an end date, and he said we were looking possibly around October. So this FTA is moving quite quickly. We're still aiming for something around that mark, but of course the substance is the important thing. So if the substance is right, we're looking at trying to conclude towards the end of the year on the UAE FTA. Chair, would you like questions on the UAE, or would you like us to move to the other FTAs?
I'm happy to move unless people have specific questions. It's probably good just to have that sort of overview stuff, and then we can move into details if people want to look at that. Yeah.
Thank you. Matt, would you like?
Thanks, John. Thank you very much, Senators. Well, for the Australia-EU Free Trade Agreement, I think we've discussed the last couple of estimates sessions, and I believe a session with Jay Scott previously as well, that of course it is an important priority for the Australian government, and it remains so. We are, and the EU remains as well, committed to concluding a free trade agreement when we're able to do so. I think, Senators, as you'll be aware, we've made 2 attempts to conclude this agreement at ministerial level. Of course, Minister Farrell travelled to Osaka for a meeting with his counterpart, Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, on 29 October last year. Prior to that, in late July, there was also a meeting in Brussels where Minister Farrell met with his counterpart as well. Unfortunately, we weren't able to conclude the deal on those occasions, and I think Minister Farrell has gone into in some detail, the fundamental issue in those negotiations has been the differences between us on agriculture market access into the European Union. Now, it's a fundamental point for us. What we're really talking about here is not all of agriculture, of course. We're talking about a number of specific sensitive products where the European Union maintains quite restrictive trade quotas. They do on a lot of their agricultural products, of course, but for us, in particular, looking at a couple of red meat lines and sugar, where the offers of access under those quotas have not been at a level that our government has judged is acceptable for Australia, given in particular the various things that the European Union is asking of Australia in return. So that's the situation where we are. What we have been consistently saying at both officials level and at ministerial level to our European counterparts is that we remain committed to this deal, and it's strategically important for both of us that we are able to make progress. But in order for us to be able to do that and to be able to secure those wider benefits of an agreement with the European Union, we do need to see an improved offer from their side, in particular on those key agricultural quota lines that I mentioned before. I think the other thing I can add is that, of course, we remain in contact with our European partners. So I think, as I believe Minister Farrell may have mentioned the last estimates as well, that earlier this year in February he met again with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis and the margins of the WTO Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi, had a further exchange about how we might move forward. And of course, there are periodic discussions at officials level as well that are looking for a pathway. But you know, the key thing for us is going to be that there is a realistic prospect of being able to make some progress on those key barriers that I mentioned to you. Final thing I'll mention before handing back to John is I think in your introduction, Chair, you mentioned, of course, the fact that there is a political season now in the European Union. So, as you will be aware, they've recently concluded their central parliamentary elections at the European Union level, and that's now playing out in the context of the selection of the senior leadership, the European Union President position and other Commission roles. We expect that it will take some time until those positions are formally in place, until a little later on this year. So that timetable within the European Union itself, of course, complicates a bit any further government-to-government level conversations on this free trade agreement. So we do need to be patient and see how that process plays out. I might pause there and hand back to John.
Thanks, Matt. For the record, John Watts from DFAT. On India, we're working towards the early conclusion of our Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or CECA, and that builds on our first agreement, which was called the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, ECTA, which has been in force now for about 18 months. As you're probably aware, the Indians have just had an election, and so there's been a bit of a pause on the sort of high-level discussion on the FTA because of the Indian elections, which only finished last month. But now that the Indian cabinet is in place, we are re-engaging. Minister Farrell spoke with his Indian counterpart, Minister Goyal, to congratulate him on his reappointment on the 20th of June, so last week, and to push for progress in the seeker discussions. It's not the same government in India. Sorry, it's the same party, but there are some changes to the cabinet. For example, there's a new agriculture secretary. So there's a slightly different complexion to the Indian cabinet. Nevertheless, we are planning our next round of negotiations for roughly mid-August. But in the background, our chief negotiators have been keeping up a conversation. And in fact, the 31st of May was the last time they virtually had a conversation. There were, just by way of background, there were a number of products that we didn't get under our first initial FTA with India. Dairy, pulses, grains, premium wine were all excluded from our first round of FTA, first agreement with India. The first agreement didn't reach what I would call our usual standard benchmark in terms of the coverage over all the trade items. So we're pushing India to boost that to up over the 90% of tariff lines, which is more in tune with what we usually conclude in a more comprehensive FTA. And we're looking at other areas like government procurement, digital trade, and some services areas in addition. So that's by way of overview, and quite happy to answer questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've got a couple and then I'll hand over to the Deputy Chair. Obviously, with both India and the EU, where these things are under negotiation for a period of time, and sometimes they move forward more quickly and smoothly, and sometimes there are pauses. One of the enduring interests of this committee is the way that the negotiating position is formed by and responsive to stakeholder views. And I can imagine that there's a challenge when you make progress in a negotiating position off the back of sectoral input, and then there's a pause, and then negotiations are resumed, and maybe the terms have shifted a bit. There might be less of an opportunity in one area or more of an opportunity in somewhere else. How do you make sure that the sort of most substantial and kind of dynamic form of stakeholder engagement occurs with all of those ups and downs, so that the businesses and the sectors that ultimately are affected by and benefit from these agreements, when they're settled, are sort of close to the bone of the actual nitty-gritty negotiating position?
Thank you, Chair. Well, we're quite. We have an intense stakeholder consultation program, as you know, at the start of negotiations, but that continues on through the negotiations. At the moment, for example, DFAT has a new initiative on a roadmap with India. So it's a bit of an update of our economic relationship with India, which is, of course, wider than the FTA. And we have people involved in that to talk with stakeholders about not just the new roadmap for the relationship, the larger relationship, but also when it comes down to our seeker negotiations, where we're at. So we give updates. We had our peak industry discussion meeting down at the National Press Club, I think about 2 weeks ago now, so that we have an annual peak organisations meeting. Then we get feedback through, for example, the Trade 2040 Task Force that the Minister chairs. So there's a constant back and forth, and there's always open, the DFAT website's always open for submissions from additional stakeholders when things change. But I think we have a pretty solid schedule of talking with different stakeholders, and having worked on these agreements for a long time, we know a lot of the players, and we meet them regularly anyway. For example, they're often in town at the start of Parliament, say Meat and Livestock Australia or the Sugar People or AdviNet. So I think it's a constant back and forth. So I think we have reached out after to let stakeholders know at the peak bodies where things were up to, so they know India's had an election and they can resubmit comments. So it's a iterative process, the way we deal with it. That's at least on the Indian side, and I'm pretty sure it applies to the EU as well. Matt?
Thank you. Look, yes, it certainly does apply. Maybe if I can just add to Mr. Watts' evidence there, just with a bit of an illustration of the way that we've managed some of this in the context of the European Union negotiations. We conducted over the main period of negotiations from when they launched in 2018 through until October last year, a little over 1,200 different stakeholder consultations. And that's consultations, not individuals. Some of those consultations may have been with 100 people, some of them may have been with a single business. The reason the number was so high for this and amounted to such a significant amount of negotiators' time was very much because a lot of it was driven by the sort of dynamic that you've described, Senator. There would be a development in the course of a negotiating round. It would give light to a new issue, either a new request or explanation of what the European Union saw as a request meaning, or maybe there would be a concession, an offer on something. And so that sort of development would trigger us to have a further conversation, maybe with some of the stakeholders who had previously provided a written submission, or otherwise with other representatives of that industry. All the way through to the end of the most recent negotiating session in Osaka in October. We even had with us in Osaka some representatives of the key agriculture sectors that were subject to those most sensitive final negotiating points. And that was an opportunity for those the representatives of those agricultural interests to have that very direct and I think very intense conversations with the Minister around exactly what the offer from the EU meant for them, and that was very much driving the input and the sort of conversations we were having with our European colleagues. So I think we have found throughout the process that has informed what we've done. Our negotiating positions have been largely guided and driven by what we're hearing from our stakeholders. And I think that process is largely similar across the range of agreements that we negotiate. One final thing I'll say on this point is, in the context of the EU free trade agreement, given that we have reached a point where a large part of the agreement is, of course, more or less done, and it is at a point where, should we be able to conclude suitable outcomes on these agriculture lines, yes, there's a handful of other things that remain, but of course they're the key. We would be able to conclude a deal fairly quickly. Well, we would, in our consultations at this stage, of course, be focusing on those remaining few sectors that are outstanding and that require that sort of intense input in order to get it over the line. What those sectors are will differ from agreement to agreement, but again, I think that reflects the way that we tend to make sure that even to the very end of the negotiation, we are doing as good a job as we can to reflect the significant interests of the most engaged stakeholders.
As you said before, with the EU, the achievement of quota access wasn't judged sufficiently good from our side, and I assume, or certainly it was reported at the time, that there were still some unresolved matters with what I think are called geographical indicators, the sort of the naming.
You can't call champagne unless it's from Champagne.
That's right.
Yes.
We've already crossed that particular bridge. Now it's Ozeco, which we need to potentially deal with as we understood at the time. I guess part of the challenge there is that it's not as if an affected sector with respect to a geographical indicator is the same part of our primary production world that stands to benefit from a particular quota achievement. So, and that's one of the things that makes it hard to judge from a national perspective, is that the gains and the impacts aren't always directly balanced. And with respect to the quotas, I guess, and this is really for people who in the community who follow these things, it's essentially about achieving a sort of a quantity of Australian goods, tonnage of a particular product that gets tariff-free or significantly reduced tariff access, and it literally comes down to whether what's being offered is worth it. That's right?
Yes, Senator, that's exactly right.
Yeah, okay. Deputy Chair?
I'm fine. Yes.
Mr Burnell?
Just outside of the agreements that you spoke about in your opening statement, is there any other treaties that we're looking at, like in discussion in relation to replacement? No?
The trade space, I mean, I know, so we've
Singapore?
there's the... I don't know about Singapore. I know there's some to do with accession applications, I suppose, with respect to some of the multilateral, plurilateral agreements.
Yes, thanks for the question. John Watts again. Look, there are no, in terms of live negotiations, United Arab Emirates, EU and India are our 3 live FTA discussions. But there are, obviously, with implementation of the other FTAs, there are reviews, there are accession discussions for other parties to join particular agreements or regional agreements.
Okay. I don't have any other questions.
One of the enduring interests of the committee is the sort of the judgment that is made about the value of trade agreements. It's a long-standing topic of interest, and it's a difficult area. But the committee has recommended on a number of occasions that there be independent economic analysis in addition to the national interest analysis that accompany these things for a couple of reasons. That I think I'm right in saying, having been part of the committee through some of those inquiries and reports, that it's both about trying to be reassured that we are getting the maximum value out of a particular agreement, but also the fact that if you undertake some analysis, as difficult as it might be, that then gives you some foundation on which to track whether what you expected to come from an agreement did in fact occur. So I guess I just ask, I mean, from this committee's point of view, we're now a little way along from both the UK and the ECTA, the Early Harvest Agreement with India. Is it already possible for us to look at the impact that those agreements have had? Is that already starting to have some measurable improvements as far as trade and investment for Australia?
Thank you, Chair. Look, the easiest way for DFAT to measure that is through the value of trade. So if you take the ECTA agreement, for example, our agriculture in the first year of implementation of that agreement, 2023, increased 59% over that year. Now, you can't put all of that down to the trade agreement, because at the same time that the trade agreement came into force, India suspended its tariffs on lentils, for example. So Australia put a lot more lentils into India in that same year. And
they did that sort of unilaterally?
Unilaterally.
Yeah,
that was a unilateral tariff reduction because they needed it for their food supply.
Yep.
So we've had a look at the agreement and broken it down and tried to take things like the lentils out of that, the stats, and the stats still show a large benefit to us on the agricultural front. So I guess the problem with measuring it is that the trade is always dynamic. You can't necessarily put down the fact that you bring in a trade agreement and next year you get a 20% jump. It doesn't necessarily mean that 20% jump is all attributable to the trade agreement. So we do try and nuance it and try and work out which bits and pieces are down to the trade agreement. Another example on that is I think with India, the agreement came into force, but there was a lot of price volatility on coal, for example, which was a major export from us. So if you actually looked at the agreement overall, you looked at our trade with India overall, the year after the agreement came into force, the overall trade actually fell. But if you worked out how much of that was down to coal, then you could see that actually, if you took coal out of that, which was due to price volatility, then actually overall our trade went up. So look, it's a very difficult question to answer with just one statistic. So we have to try and work it out.
We seem
overall
to spend an inordinate amount of time talking about wine, and that was a topic in relation to both the India and the UK agreements. Has there been anything? I know that the wine sector in relation to India, the Australian wine sector was pleased. You know, there were some hard-fought wins there, but I think, as you said before, it didn't really cover. It sort of kept Australia in the kind of low-value wine export category. Effectively, we're still very, very high tariff supplying to Australian wine that is into those sort of upper echelons of quality and price. Has there been any significant difference through either of those agreements, India or the UK, with respect to the exports of Australian wine?
On India, you are correct, Chair. There was market access granted for premium wine. So that was over $5 US a bottle, I think was the benchmark used. We have, in our current negotiations with India, asked for underneath that $5 a bottle limit. I'd have to take on notice what has happened on the premium end of the market.
Okay. Yeah. And with respect to the UK, there was some conversation at the time. Well, we were alerted to the fact that there were some things that seemed to be an improvement for access for Australian wine into the UK, but there was also some sort of murmuring that was coming out of the UK at the time that they were undertaking some domestic reform. I don't know whether it was volumetric alcohol tariff or something. That there were people of a protectionist kind in the UK who were saying, well, while it seems like we're giving access to Australia, the effect of this domestic change will kind of negate that, and it'll be a zero-sum game. I'm just interested in knowing whether, I think it was the case that after China changed its approach to Australian wine, that UK was our biggest wine export market. Perhaps that's starting to rebalance now with China removing the sort of geo-economic coercion that had applied to Australian wine. But were we seeing higher volumes of Australian wine going into the UK?
Thank you, Chair. I have to look at the stats for the Australian wine going into the UK, but on your basic question, I think it goes to an issue of an excise tax that the UK was bringing in for health reasons. They wanted to increase the price of the wine, is my understanding. But that excise tax was not targeted at Australia, it was targeted across the board.
Right.
So the advantage we got on the tariffs was still meant something to the industry, because the excise applied to all of, including us, but all of the UK's trading partners. So it was not a case that the increase in excise negated the benefits of the free trade agreement. Those tariff reductions still took place.
Okay. My last question, which you might want to take on notice, is just around the benefit of the plurilateral agreements we've entered into in recent times, the CPTPP and the RCEP, but also the upgraded ANSFATAR. You know, it's understandable that the benefits of those agreements aren't often about improved quota access or improved tariffs, that they're more about improved harmonisation, and through that some sort of what are described as supply chain benefits, where you get that sort of harmonisation within a group of countries. The way that Australia benefits is sometimes because of the way that what we contribute to a product, the value of what we contribute to a product is increased because of the sort of interregional flow that occurs through that sort of harmonisation. We're always told that the benefit of that is very hard to calculate. It's very hard to describe. But I'm sort of interested in the way that the department tries to look at that and see whether what we expect might occur from those broader supply chain benefits actually comes about. And, you know, maybe that you can't say too much about it here, but if there was some analysis that occurred in the department that looked at those kinds of things, perhaps on a case study basis, like I often find that it's easiest if, rather than it being in general terms, people are able to say, well, here's some material that gets exported from Australia into Vietnam that then becomes part of a product, a consolidated product, that is now increased its production and its sort of regional trading, partly off the basis of CPTPP or RCEP or one of those agreements. I think that would be something that would improve the way committee members understand the value of those agreements.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'll take on notice the case studies. I would say when it comes to the supply chain issue, I think there are two elements to it. One is that Australian business asks us to facilitate the ability to be able to assemble and have different production in different countries, because that provides flexibility to their production model. You know, that they assemble they add one input from one country, one input from another. They might assemble somewhere else or assemble back in Australia. So they want that flexibility in those rules, what we call the rules of origin. So they can accumulate. It's called accumulation. You can accumulate different parts from different countries, different economies, and still manage to get the lower tariff when you export out into the region. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of the supply chain is really the resilience bit. And that's to provide security for if you have a disruption in one part of the supply chain, that throughout the region you can source that product from a different part, from a different country, and we have access to that input from a different country. So I would say that there were two aspects to that. Business asks for greater facilitation in the region for two reasons. One is the accumulation, but also for the supply chain resilience and assurance. But I can take the question about case studies on notice and get back to you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's nothing further. Well, thank you all for your attendance here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. This briefing is obviously not related to an inquiry or a report or related timetable, but if just for the sake of us getting things in a timely way, if any of those responses could be provided. The date I've got here is the 15th of July. That's not the hardest of hard dates. Obviously, as I say, it's not to enable a particular piece of work, but we'd appreciate that as we appreciate your evidence today. And on that basis, I now declare this briefing closed. Thank you.